Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Colleen Vincent. I am the VP of Community for the James Beard Foundation, and I want to welcome you to our Gather Film Q&A about the fight to reclaim Native foodways. So welcome to a very special conversation and Q&A for Gather, a new film releasing in early September. But first, housekeeping rules. This event is being recorded and we'll send out a link to the recording after the program wraps. We'll save the questions for the end as time allows, so please write your questions at any time using the webinar toolbar. If you are having technical difficulties, please message us using the webinar toolbar and we'll do what we can to troubleshoot. And now, Gather is a film that is an intimate and timely portrait of the growing movement among Native Americans to reclaim their spiritual, political, and cultural identities through food sovereignty while battling the trauma of centuries of genocide. The persons that you see in the film include Nephi Craig, the founder of the Native American Culinary Association, Twila Cassadore of the I Collective, who is joining us here today, Samuel Genshaw, co-founder of the Ancestral Guard, Elsie Dubray, a Stanford undergrad student, and Clayton Harvey of the People's Farm. Tonight's panel include director Sanjay Rawal, who is a 2015 James Beard Award Media Award winner for Best Documentary. He is the director and producer known for Food Chains, a film about tomato pickers in Florida, the Coalition of Imalaki Workers. This upcoming film, Gather, is about Native American food sovereignty and was made under the guidance of one of the most vaunted NGOs in Indian country, the First Nations Development Institute. Sanjay is an advocate for oneness and works to develop a wide variety of strategies to help nations improve the quality of life for marginalized workers. He works to educate audiences about human rights issues all over the world. Our next guest is A-dae Romero-Briones, who is familiar to some of you as she's been curating our second Tuesday of the month industry support webinars. She is the director of programs, Native Food and Agricultural Program for the First Nations Development Institute. She is a Fulbright Scholar, a White House Champion of Change in Agriculture as recognized by President Obama, founder and board member of several initiatives and institutes, such as the Aspen Institute's Rural Development Initiative. She has her Juris Doctorate from Arizona State's University's College of Law and an LLM in Food and Agriculture Law from the University of Arkansas. And she is also an executive producer on this film. Our next guest is seed and knowledge keeper and master forager, Twila Cassadore of the I Collective. Twila has been working with the San Carlos Apache, White Mountain Apache, and Yavapai peoples for the past 25 years, conducting interviews with elders to bring information back into the community to address health and social problems with the Western Apache Diet Project. Twila has documented the importance of foods like grass seeds and acorn seeds to the diets of Apaches before people were moved onto reservations and became reliant on rations and later commodities. Our next guest is journalist Kim Baca. Kim is the owner of KB Consultant, a marketing and communications firm specializing in outreach to Native American audiences. A former journalist with regional papers and the Associated Press, she has also conducted public relations and government affairs and legislative work with the New Mexico House of Representatives speaker and nonprofit organizations nationwide. And she was also the interim director of the Native American Journalists Association that helmed the 2017, 2018, and 2019 journalism project that led to this film. And now I'd like to show you a trailer of Gather. And now I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Sanjay Rawal for a few remarks about his film.
Hi, everyone. I'm so grateful to the James Beard Foundation for giving us this platform. I'm even more grateful to those who have been involved with the film, A-dae, Kim, Twila. As people might realize, I'm Indian from India, and there's a standing joke that somehow I got into this project because they didn't realize what kind of Indian I was. But that said, it's been an honor to learn about the deep ancestral food traditions here on Turtle Island under the express guidance of A-dae and Kim and others. We very much wanted to just present reality and to find experts who worked with plants, with places, with people who could showcase the beauty and the power of Native American foodways. So thank you everyone for joining us in this conversation. And for those who watched the film, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Sanjay. And before we continue, I just want to acknowledge that I'm on traditional Lenape land, also known as Brooklyn. And the first question I have is actually for both Sanjay and Kim regarding kind of the collaborative process and kind of the impetus for the groundwork eventually of this project. So Sanjay, if you want to start and then turn it over to Kim to kind of, talk more about her contribution and her like essentially gathering a lot of the source material.
Documentary filmmaking is exploitative in its nature. You're going to community, asking people for stories, and from an industry standpoint, the entire documentary industry began with an exploitative ethnographic film called Nanook of the North in 1929 by an American filmmaker, Robert Flaherty. So since then, Native Americans and indigenous people around the world have had their stories told to them, have had stories that were never meant to be public, taken and told to the public. So when A-dae and I went through Indian country, meeting characters and developing the movie, there were a number of people who shared stories with us that I, as a filmmaker, knew were never going to be in the film, but we wanted to satisfy that expectation of their offering of their sacred stories to the world at large. And we were lucky enough to work with Kim in helping to materialize those stories into journalistic content, finding Native American writers and journalists and photographers who could document these sacred stories that had tremendous value, that were offered with generosity from the heart, but that we knew weren't going to make it into the film.
Yeah. Hold on, let's find out. Kim, here we go. I will unmute you.
There we go. Thank you. Yes, what we looked for are folks that were working in Indian country. We went everywhere from, had stories from Northern California to Hawaii to the traditional ancient fish ponds. We were also in the Pueblo of Tesuque, looking at the food system there. They had hired somebody from Bolivia who had turned their orchard into several acres. It was a small farm and that he had developed into several acres and incorporated the elders into that as well to get the senior citizens, of course, active, and then, of course, farming again. We were in Arizona as well, talking to an artist who did in the middle of the desert, doing depictions of salmon from traditional people. So we looked at a variety of areas in any country, and as Sanjay was mentioning, we made sure that we had indigenous voices. Our perspectives, our worldview is different from traditional, obviously, journalists. What questions could we ask, or what perspectives could we bring, and then what questions shouldn't we ask? What are things that we should keep sacred?
So how many subjects were kind of documented before the film? How many, if you know off the top of your head, how many stories did you pull together? 2017, 2018, 2019.
We ended up telling 11 stories through Kim's project, and in that case, hiring 11 Native journalists to tell those stories. But right off the bat, when A-dae and I and our other producers went through Indian country and met the characters that are in the film, like Nephi Craig, a chef from White Mountain Apache, Twila Cassadore, Sammy Jen saw his brothers and those on the Yurok and Hupa nations, and then Elsie Dubray from Cheyenne River, Lakota. We knew that would be the basis of our story. We knew that they would form the core of the story, just because of, number one, the stellar quality of their work, but also their ease in front of the camera and their willingness and their trust in us to tell their stories.
And when I watch this film, and I will try my best not to give it too much away to people who haven't watched it yet, I highly encourage it. When I watched this film, what I saw was there's this thing that happens in food where people are like, let's bring back old ways, although it's through a very particular kind of lens, and it's always kind of ahistorical. It's like old ways are good, let's just bring them back without talking about why they disappeared. And so they're very tough things to hear and learn in this film, but it's not a process that drags everyone down. But A-dae, you have been very immersed in systems work, and so if you could kind of elucidate for our audience, modern food systems and their connection to, to be very frank, stolen land, stolen food that has no attribution, has no historical reference, and then also this, the fact that there are all these foodways right here in America, and all this history to turn to, and it's lost to the broader nation. So if you would talk more about like modern food systems and they're in relation to this film.
Yes, absolutely. So I think we have a food system that is the way it is by design. And when Indigenous people talk about foodways, there's always an understanding that even though these foods are like no longer being processed, or foods that our grandparents ate that we can no longer find, it's hard for us to say those are old ways, because it's almost like they're just dormant, right? Like it's just barely out of our reach because of some systematic process that made it that way. And so when we think about like Indigenous, and often we hear the term food movement, a movement implies that there's a beginning or an end, but to my grandparents, to my children, to many Indigenous communities, our whole purpose is to cultivate these lands and to cultivate these foods. This is our connection to our environment. And, modern science is barely catching up with that kind of pedagogy, in that our food is how our bodies adapt to our environment. And we're seeing the need for that kind of science with climate change. And most importantly, I think the number one falsity that is our whole entire food system is built on is this idea of agriculture, right? Agriculture in the American sense didn't include Indigenous people. Agriculture was the fine line that determined whether you were civilized or wild. And it was the fine line in which like civilization was built. But there's a lot of falsities in that concept, in that Indigenous people did farm, Indigenous people did cultivate lands, and that agriculture didn't start when you put a fence around a square or when you move the water. Like all these understandings that our modern food system are built on, Indigenous people just by existing challenge. And so I love the film because it's a challenge to what we think our food system should look like. And there are so many indigenous people that have everything to offer to this conversation. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. And one of those people, Twila, is actually on the phone, even though you can't see her on the camera. And she is very much an integral part of this story. I had the pleasure of meeting both her and A-dae last year in Oneida Country at a food sovereignty summit. And, you know, in this film, you know, there are very personal things that Twila talks about in this film, but you know, something very beautiful that happens, and I don't think I'm spoiling too much by saying this, but Twila takes her niece through the land, pointing out different aspects of it, foraging, and you know, certainly like capturing a particular protein, and then showing other people how to cook it, what it's supposed to taste like. But you know, Twila, you talk about you in both aspects, you are transmitting knowledge to a young person who has been through a lot, and you yourself have been through a lot, and how is connecting back to, you know, the ways of doing of your, you know, your ancestors, your parents, your grandparents, how has that kind of evolved? What has it done for your spirit? What do you perceive it as doing for your niece's spirit? So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, for reconnecting, it's just really filling this empty void that some of us as indigenous people are experiencing, that have been disconnected from Mother Earth entirely. And just reconnecting is just, when you see May, little May, you see her collecting things. It's just looking at me when I saw myself as a smaller child. But I grew up that way. And for her was just like, this is totally new. But it's also reconnecting her to the land and understanding a little bit about how it's not only that it sustained us, but how it's used in different ceremonies today. And it really brings a lot of more value to food than it just being food.
And you know, I actually was really fascinated about how, you know, people think of, when they think of foragers, for example, especially foragers of color, let's just put it out there, they don't necessarily understand that the ways of doing are things that have been like perfected and passed on through the ages. And so, you know, the fact that you're perfecting and passing on to your niece kind of the way to sustain herself, but also her like future descendants, should she choose to have them, kind of reminds me of, you know, the two young people in the film who you know, are very much committed to a sustainable future. And in particular, the young Stanford undergrad student who is using Western science to prove things that people already knew.
Yes.
And so, you know, I wanna ask Sanjay about the unfolding of that particular story. And then, you know, Twila, are there some, like, I guess, things that have been revealed to you as being part of this process as a forager and also as a subject of the film, about the kind of the dovetail between Western ways of thinking and indigenous ways of doing? So Sanjay, we'll start with you about this this incredible young woman.
Elsie Dubray grew up on a buffalo ranch in South Dakota. As people might know from the movie or from just history, there were more than 60 million buffalo spread across Turtle Island, all the way from Alaska down to Florida and into Mexico. But as part of a concerted US government and military-led operation, those 63 million were taken down to a herd of 23 individuals, out of which most buffalo that exist today have been bred. So Elsie's dad is Lakota, the Buffalo people. They have a history of thousands of years of symbiotic and spiritual relationships with buffalo. And buffalo were the apex animal in North America. Many ecosystems were wrapped around the buffalo schedule of migration. So fast forward into the 1940s, it's the boarding school era where children were taken away from their parents and forced into US government boarding schools. Elsie's dad, Fred, was no exception. But he felt something deep when he left his land to go to boarding school. When he was at that boarding school, all he could do was dream of that land and dream of it in its most pristine state. And to him, that pristine state involved millions of buffaloes roaming. So when he graduated from boarding school and then college, he set forth a path to try to bring millions of buffalo back to the Great Plains. And he was fairly successful as an individual. And so his young daughter, Elsie, grew up with those Lakota values, understanding the importance of Mother Earth, the importance of the four directions. And as she began to chart a career path, she really wanted to just focus her energy on traditional foods. She says in panels now, she's a little embarrassed that when she was 17, 16, she even used the word prove when it came to science and native foods. Right now, she is just trying to deepen the scientific data around native foods and create systems that will allow for those foods to be included back into native lifestyles, both on the sociological standpoint, but also on the policy standpoint, removing barriers that the US government still maintains that makes it impossible and in many cases illegal for Native Americans to practice their traditional foodways.
Wow. Twila?
Okay. I'm still thinking a second.
Okay.
Okay. No, it's actually when you look at it, they talk about, when we're talking, for me, it's talking about holistic health. It's just about being happy in today's world. Nothing in this modern world in colonization teaches you just to be happy. And for me, foraging and taking young people out there, it's taking young people, they're dealing with many daily challenges and working with the wellness programs, going out there. They've forgotten their problems. Something in that is actually a lot healing than putting them on medication, which science does not allow. They say this is not a method that we can use within our communities, but yet we're challenging that method because it's a proven method. We don't exactly have to say proven, it works. I've seen it personally work firsthand with many young people, but yet it's not accepted because there's not a dollar mark on it for the pharmaceutical to make. And so using this holistic approach of traditional foraging, it also taps into the healing process of many young people and older people and just people in general that are wanting to reconnect with the land and just touching dirt itself. I mean, just being, you going out there foraging and harvesting, it does something to your overall health just to be out there. But looking at the community health wise, how beneficial it is to our tribes and to not only our tribe, but to people in general. I hope that helped answer some.
That's amazing. First of all, I felt that as like personally, I feel that, the connection to the land gives a perspective of first being part of a greater whole,
Yes.
but also connecting to that greater whole, whatever you want to call it, however big you want to get it, that is how we sustained ourselves in various cultures for millennia. And so we
Yes.
are in a moment now, and I kind of, I want to address this to Kim and then to A-dae, that we are in a critical moment, whether we wish to be or not. in broader discussions about equity, but you know, a lot of people haven't even addressed the indigenous food sovereignty movement or decolonization in general. So how do we move this conversation forward? And it doesn't, you know, your answer doesn't have to be perfect, but it is, you know, things that people can do to kind of extend the conversation and begin what essentially is a very difficult process of unlearning. So Kim, we'll start with you, and then A-dae, I'd love for you to kind of weigh in on the topic.
Well, one way to do it is the extension of what we already started, which would be to get these stories into the public sphere. Places like anywhere that there's that challenge or question of how we practice our traditional foods, practice our traditional food gatherings or those types of things. You know, places in California have been challenged up and down the coast that they can't go and get seaweed or mussels or various things that they've done since time immemorial. So having those stories in the public sphere, films like Gather, and then having publications also support that, and Indigenous people who can tell these stories can not only get access, but tell it in a way that is very personal for some. It is journalism, but also making sure that they're, you know, getting the facts out, finding ways to tell the story rather than just someone else dropping in, going to Northern California, spending, you know, a day with a group in California, a tribe in California, and then leaving to write the story. Whereas if you have an Indigenous person who, you know, may understand the issue, may even live there, can tell the story in a way that really gets to the heart of what the issue is and all the nuances of it. Those are some ways of just keeping it in that public sphere.
Thank you, Kim. A-dae?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, we're all being challenged. We're all being challenged about what we fundamentally believe our society should look like. And I challenge everybody because society was created without recognition of Indigenous people, right? Like, it began the moment we got moved to someplace else. It began the moment we got put into a square and said, this is your reservation. It began when we no longer existed in some of the most pristine places in America. And so, like, we started out the webinar by doing the land acknowledgement for the Lenape, but I would say every single one of us in America needs to do that. What land are you sitting on? But one step further, don't just say, I'm going to acknowledge the land and just go on my daily life and just realize, like, okay, like, yes, it's a big step to know who the original people were of that land, but I'm asking people to take another step. Like, what would it look like, or what would you have to do in order for that land to be accessible to those people again? And it's a really hairy, complicated question and thought process, because, you know, there's so many things that have to happen in order for Indigenous people to have access to their lands again, but it's one that has to start. And so, like, we may not have answers today, but you know, the fact is we got to start thinking in those terms. Like, our land, we have fires in California, we're having floods and double hurricanes, we're having all these natural disasters that are resulting from the way we've cared for the land in the past 500 years. So, like, you know, now's the time to start thinking about what those practices are that are more in line with reciprocity. And that starts by, you know what, Indigenous people need to have access to their lands. They need to practice land stewardship. I think Twila was right on where she said, you know, like, we're talking about happiness. There's a happiness that happens when people are out there caring for the land, whether it's through gathering, whether it's through growing, in ways that are reciprocal. And so those, you know, that's the complicated answer, but Twila was much better when she said, you know, like, we got to think about like what makes us happy. And sometimes that's as simple as putting your hands in the dirt with an indigenous person from that land who's done that for generations.
Indeed, and you know, I think part of the challenge, I will say, is that first, in acknowledging that people lived on this land, it means reckoning with very many things. And among them, I think, in general, the populace has this idea that people don't exist anymore. And you know, stories and archival material like Kim's and like Sanjay's and yours and Twila works indicates that not only people exist, that they are very diverse, they are very active, and continue to be stewards of land to the best of their ability. And you talked about like climate change as a result of this, and I remember learning, and don't quote me on this, but that land stewarded by indigenous people are actually more sustainable, and resistant to climate change than others. And so there's the broader community at stake. But Sanjay, you know, you put some interesting stats that people kind of know in passing, but what are the stakes for individuals in these communities in not having, you know, access to lands and access to traditional foodways?
Well, you know, I think we need to state a little bit of the modern history. 500, 600 years ago, most of the world existed as pueblos, as small communities who had lived in those areas for generations, if not thousands and thousands of years. But somewhere around the Crusades, businessmen in Europe realized they could make a ton of money by extracting value from the land that other people lived on. And so at that stage, they kind of got an imprimatur from the Catholic Church that allowed them to classify Christians, because they were going into the Middle East, to the birthplace of Christianity and Islam. They got an imprimatur that categorized Christians based on skin color, that the whiter the Christian, the better. And for the audience, I don't care who's Christian and who's not, but we can agree that this is kind of a bonkers concept, that people who were the first Christians, and one of the first Christians came from South India. St. Thomas was from Kerala. So Christians were brown and white and black since the Christ roamed the earth. They began practicing tactics around this sort of extractive economy in Wales, in the Basque Country, and then got huge investment. Remember, the first galleons were investors. They were sent over to the New World to practice this new form of extractive land-based capitalism. They were looking for minerals under the land, gold. They were looking for land that they could turn into cash crops, cotton, sugar, tobacco, and they were looking for timber. Indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere had civilizations that were just as old, if not older, than the civilizations that were sending ships over, and sometimes much, much older. They were much more organized, much more artistic, deep spirituality. And the Europeans came over and recognized an agricultural system that was already in place. The people on the East Coast that started farms, the first settlers, they didn't carve those farms out of the wild. They stole those farms. In 1763, the British forbade American settlers from crossing the Appalachian Mountains into the Northwest Territory, Ohio, Indiana, because the British couldn't support that sort of sustained expansion. Why would they need to support it? Because the people that wanted to settle Indiana and Ohio were farmers who had monocropped fields that were taken care of by indigenous people for thousands of years. They needed more land. So the first westward push was destructive and taking other people's land, other people's crops. It's ridiculous to think that 70% of the global variety of food comes from crops from native science: tomatoes, potatoes, peppers from India. There was no spicy food before the 1500s. And the first thing that settlers wanted to do was destroy an already functioning food system and supplant a European-style agricultural farming economy. how many millions of pieces of information have been lost. And again, this is coming from me from a non-native standpoint, but how many things could still exist right now that would help the rest of us who are now here on this stolen land? Number one, the foods would be amazing, but number two, we might have a different attitude. We might actually understand that we're stewards of the land rather than looking at this perpetual extractive economy. I have no idea if I answered your question, but
That's okay.
I wanted to
That was-
lay that the roots of the American economy were based on land and labor. And when we look at the great advocacy of BLM around labor, we also have to keep in mind that the first laborers that were, essentially wiped out were natives in Hispaniola, and then natives across the country. And moreover, that land that's so sacred was extracted from them to basically build the US economy. So from that vantage point of knowing what our country's history is, we can realize that where we're at right now started from a place of inequity for all of the original people.
And the tangible results of that inequity, very specifically on the various native populations, have led to tremendously challenging health problems, issues of obesity, addiction, mental illness.
The land is still valuable. That's the inherent quote problem with all of this. At some point, morality took over the explicit genocide, but the land still held value, and natives are seen. You can see this in policy as being an impediment for the industrial American economy to expand its land holding. So they were pushed in many senses to the farthest reaches of the supply chain, as far away from urban economic centers. So not only do they have terrible processed food on supply chains that are expensive, they've also been taken away through boarding schools and other cultural measures. They've been taken away from those traditional forms of knowledge. And so the policies continue. But A-dae is the expert. I'm rambling just because this stuff gets.
Well, because this question will be for both Kim and A-dae. Kim as a person of journalistic bent, and then A-dae in terms of somebody who's fully immersed in food systems work. We talk about these particular health outcomes, and we can't talk about them with first not mentioning Naftali, who's in the film, but also Sean Sherman, who is basically the native chef with the household name in the broader culture. But the original hyperlocal regional food systems were created by various indigenous tribes. So how do we reconcile the fact that, local, regional, seasonal is, the hallmark of what is good food, and the fact that the only household name of native chef, is Sean Sherman? How do we reconcile these two facts? How do we get here A-dae? And then Kim.
Yes. Well, I think Kim stated it well earlier. Like, there is an invisibility factor at play here. There's a reason you don't see a lot of indigenous people in pop culture, in mainstream media, or even our history books, right? Like, if our history books, the very basic education that people get in America, don't include indigenous people, you're not going to see them, even if they're right in front of your face, on a grander scale. And the other thing is we have wonderful indigenous chefs. Some of my favorite are like Ben Jacobs or Britt Reed or Christina Stanley, and you can find them at iCollective. They're doing wonderful work, and there's many indigenous chefs. And I would say the first indigenous chefs are people like my grandma, who the movie is dedicated to, where really most of these recipes and these understandings came from. They came from a whole generation who didn't consider themselves professionals. They saw themselves as indigenous people doing what indigenous people do, which is work our land, care for our land, and feed our people. And so that is really, I mean, it's such a basic understanding of how we function as a society. It's taken a lot of folks a while to get to the point where they're seeing themselves as professional chefs, but there is a grand movement happening in Indian country, which is so exciting to see. And in terms of like the health effects, right? When people ask me about that, it's important to know that this isn't just happening to Indian people. Indigenous people have been eating these foods probably for longer than the rest of the society, in terms of when we got, high fat, high sugar, high carbs, corn syrup. Like that was those are basic ingredients in what they gave us when we were isolated from our own lands, right? Those were the foodstuffs that we were given. But you know what? What's the basis of the American diet today? High fat, high sugar, high carbohydrates. So it's important for America to recognize what's happening to Indigenous people, because the same timeline is being imposed on our society as a whole. And so it's not just Indigenous people that are having these health outcomes, it's all of Americans, if not everyone on the Western diet. And so it's always important to note that, like, we're all eating the same things. Like, everyone's not far from the McDonald's. Not everyone is far from processed flour and sugar, and they're just very accessible. I'll turn it over to Kim before I start to ramble more.
It's okay. It's okay. Yes, Kim.
So one of the ways that I think is in a larger scope that is part of the reconciliation is that there are places like Civil Eats that have actually invested into an Indigenous food writer. Other places like High Country News that have a tribal desk that are looking at incorporating those types of issues in the public sphere. And the amazing thing, I think, is that our own people are also taking to YouTube, to doing their own podcast. There's a woman who's a producer for a national radio show, Native American radio show, Andy Murphy, who's Diné Navajo. She's Toasted Sister. You can find her on all segments, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, etc. She produces her own podcast, and she interviews a lot of the chefs that A-dae was just mentioning. And she has her own zine. She's just doing incredible work. So we are telling her own stories and highlighting some of that. And she has a huge following. So we see those articles too. Vogue drops in because this is so trendy. But I'm seeing more and more in the public sphere of folks that are taking an interest because of the health benefits, because it's just good food, and people love food and want to know more about the folks that are putting it together and what the ingredients that are being incorporated, and then the stories behind that. So it's becoming, I think, more so less trendy and more mainstream as people understand it and recognize this, and the chefs themselves.
I appreciate that. I think that once people start realizing, and I should only speak for myself, once people start realizing, yes, certainly like what's at stake, but also that, our whole idea of good food kind of starts from a very wrong place. One that elevates person over people, one that, elevates like ingredient over terroir. I'm using that word because I can't figure out another word, but of place and time. And I think that once those values start shifting, that certainly these kinds of acknowledgements won't be special occasions. They will be part of how we think about food. And speaking of how we think about food, Twila, as a master forager and knowledge keeper, and I think that's a very like kind of an amazing kind of I want to say appellation. I probably said that wrong, but you know, it's not chef. And I actually had one chef, one culinarian of indigenous heritage who told me that did not appreciate the term chef because he felt like it was a white supremacist construct, and gave me a really great assessment that I found very valuable. But Twila, how do we elevate the work that you and others are doing in terms of, foraging the land, which is different from farming the land, right? And while there is a farmer in this
Yes.
film, Twyla, it's what you do is not a usual thing, but it is a thing that people do. And it's a skill. Like, how do we elevate that kind of skill set as one that is treasured and valued, and also, more importantly, spread broadly?
Okay, I'm having a little audio problem.
Oh, I hear you.
Okay, you're gonna have to repeat that. I had a little audio problem.
No, I was asking, how can we elevate like the work that you do as a master chef and master forager as like a viable and real thing outside of chef and farmer, because it's not just traditional work, but it is like real labor that goes into the work that you do.
Okay. It's just outreach with throughout the communities, different communities throughout Indian countries, acknowledging that these traditional methods are should be a part of everyday life. But for now, we look at it as occasionally, oh, it's acorn season, let's go. But it's not everyday life. And acknowledging that these methods do sustain you. This type of method is more sustainable and more beneficial than what this modern diet pyramid. I don't know, this diamond, or I don't know what it's called, a pyramid shape. But we never had a pyramid, and we've always had this diet within us, and we've always followed the season. Mother Earth taught us everything that we needed to know, but transferring that knowledge to young people is probably just allowing, I don't know, the challenge is getting across through healthcare, through the education system, through part of this new, I said the education system and the healthcare, and looking at it, I don't know, people look at it differently, about how do we teach our young people. It's just allowing them the choices, like when they go to the schools. I went to Alaska, Anchorage. They have phenomenal optional food choices for the community. We're limited. We're just stuck with, the school district allows this, the healthcare allows this, but allowing traditional food to be brought into the system. And I think a lot of it is just introduction and teaching and encouraging people from the community, and knowing that there's people in the community that do this. And me, I'm just like on a small scale. I have elders and grandparents. Those guys are like the PhDs of this place. But I'm on the smaller scale of this knowledge, and imagine what can be done with everybody sharing this knowledge.
Thank
I
you,
hope that
Twila.
helps answer.
No, that's amazing.
Can I just add something to that, Colleen?
Yeah.
So I think you hit it. You were totally right when you talk about the tastes and putting like food above people, above community. I think when we talk about master foragers and folks like Twila, there's a whole science around it. I mean, and not that we need to prove indigenous methods, but it's called incipient domestication. And it's that period just before you get domesticated crops and the period after they're wild. And people are finding like that space is the space where our environments are most balanced. So when you think about like a person who goes and collects bulbs, right? They're collecting bulbs just like the elk have eaten those bulbs or big deer have eaten those bulbs. And so it depopulates this area. It allows soil to breathe, and but it's like a food for people. So we're imitating nature and how nature would naturally care for itself. And we're just adding that extra, like the extra spice to whatever nature is already doing. And so that space in incipient domestication is where like the sweet spot is. It's not the sugar, it's not the salt, it's the place where we are totally in tune with our environment. And I think that's what Twila is teaching May. That's what our foragers teach us. That's what our hunters teach us, is that you have to know what that balance is.
Thank you, A-dae. I keep asking questions, but you guys can type them in the chat as well. So, you know, colonization happens, right? And you guys mentioned this in the, you know, in the practice run, but it's true. Colonization happens, and the Constitution doesn't happen until way after that. And, you know, this film is very much about rights that we think of as inalienable, but certainly have been kind of snatched away. How can we reclaim them? Like Kim through what are policy positions? What are media actions? What are, you know, personal actions of individuals, people that, you know, say that they care about food? What are those positions? And I know A-dae is a great person to ask this as well, and Sanjay is a great person to ask this as well. So I'm gonna kind of like run through it with the three of you, if you don't mind.
Well, immediately, I'm just going to throw out a quick answer, then I'll throw it to Sanjay. But like, there are indigenous people who are offering indigenous products right now, right? If you go to indianagfoods.org, there's a whole variety of indigenous businesses who are offering products from their lands, right? You have temporary beans, you have, you know, special teas, you have all these indigenous ingredients that are available for purchase. And I think that's like the first step, right? Like figuring out what these foods are, finding places where you can get them without supplanting or displacing indigenous people. That's the last thing we want to do, is take somebody's food source when they need it over the winter time. And so this place, agfoods.org, is like the place to start. So I would encourage people to explore there. Sanjay?
Well, I think A-dae hits the nail on the head. There's like two sides of the same coin. There's traditions that shouldn't be shared, that shouldn't be known, that shouldn't be touched. But at the same time, we know that there is an I mean, I wouldn't even say lack. There are like next to no native chefs that are in commercial restaurants. And it's not because there isn't interest, but it's because those pipelines either haven't been built, or native chefs have faced a more severe amount of discrimination than people might realize. And there's no data to support any of this, because there's no one that's really studied why natives aren't really in the supply chain. But that said, we know that chefs, sous chefs, executive chefs hold a tremendous amount of power in a supply chain that's not based on dollar values. They're not Walmart, they're not, you know, Publix or Kroger, but they can set food trends because people revere chefs. People have always revered the person that can make our stomachs and our hearts happy. I know chefs that spend hours going to farmers markets, hours researching provisions, hours meeting producers, you know, in the attempt of incorporating those ingredients into menus years in the future. There are tons of Native American capitalists out there in the food system. Like those in New York, you know, might not know that the Shinnecock tribe on Eastern Long Island, they roast coffee. That's the first step. There are Native Americans everywhere, and chances are they're at the farmer's market. They're producing things that restaurants can pick up. And you know how it is. If you develop that relationship around a commercial product and you get to know the person and they trust you, they began sharing other things with you. They began sharing other uses of those ingredients. They began allowing you permission to cook things in a certain way. And there's nothing that chefs like more than being at the forefront of a trend. And so there are knowledge keepers out there. There are native chefs out there that executive chefs can hire as sous chefs. There are native food producers out there that are actually willing and have culturally appropriate products for Western palates and Western supply chains.
Thank you, Sanjay. Kim?
I'll let Twila answer this question. I think she's a lot closer than than I am to that.
Okay, Twila, what are the things that, policy positions, actions, reports, certainly journalism, that would, lead to this reclamation of rights? I mean, it's happening physically anyway, people are certainly taking back the power that they have, but what are the things that people around the fringes or on the outside of the community can do to kind of push this forward?
I think supporting the native community's economy and buying locally, purchasing locally. We have a lot of indigenous vendors in Indian country that aren't being utilized, that could be utilized, but that could be beneficial to a lot of the, not only to the economy of the tribe, but also to the individuals. There's a question that's never been asked, so so I'm gonna send it back to A-dae.
Okay. I mean, but Twilight, before we send it back to A-dae,
If anybody has more land to allow Twila to gather on, like, do it. If anybody has land to allow other indigenous people to gather on, do it. I think that's also a good policy position.
Yes, I like that. Yes, there you go.
I have a question. Let's see. All right. So, and this is more than one question. It's more than one person that asked this question. So somebody says, I love foraging, but if everyone in the US did it, we'd run into a resource crisis. How can we promote foraging over our commercial food system without over-harvesting the land?
For some areas, it's just knowing the land and knowing what you're going to harvest. Like for myself, I have a lot of people question, oh, I think you're taking too much. But if you know the land, you know what you're taking, and you're being respectful to the land because you know what's going to grow back within before next season. And just having that, once you gain a relationship with the land, that land's gonna allow you to forage what you want, but respectfully. It's not to over forage. I know, like for my community on the St. Clair Apache tribe, it's I believe it's 1.8 million acres, but it is not enough to support a community. This tribe, it's not enough. When you look at the amount of food that's out there, it will not support the tribe based on the fact that we were relocated and so many things have shifted. But when you learn and gain respect of the land, you start finding all these foods, and there's always an abundance of it after. Oh, hello. Okay. So they're usually like this season, we have fires. I mean, fires are going rampant right now, but it's also nurturing the land, that's helping it to heal and bringing back more than what we're looking at. We're looking at it in this white, and I say why, I'm sorry, with this non-native perspective, and you look like, oh my gosh, all that food is gone. But I'm looking at it like it's healing. It's going to bring back more. It's just something that's happening in this time. But when you look at it and you realize you cherish the food that you forage. I do. I look at the desert, the prickly pears. I was supposed to collect more yesterday. I went out, they're gone. They burnt. And that's an area that most areas are closed because of the fire. So I'm not allowed to go past a certain checkpoint anymore, even though there may be food there. So next season, I'll see a lot. And it's just knowing the land. And people, I think when you know your plants, you know your land, you know the story, you know all these things that intertwine with it, you realize, I don't know, it's just so hard to explain that part, because I go out and forage just enough. I don't go in like, oh, I'm gonna take all of this food for myself. No, it's just taking what you need. So I hope that helped answer.
No, yes, it
And,
definitely
and
helps.
I would add that that is the antithesis of indigenous culture and the epitome of American culture, that question, because that's the tragedy of the commons, right? That's the tragedy of American capitalism, is you can't have common resources without them being exploited. And so that question is really about like American society. Like, how can you change the whole system so that you're not exploitative? And one of the answers that indigenous people, as Twila stated, is this is not just about you foraging. This is about a community. This is about an entire landscape. And if you're the only one foraging, something is wrong in that system. That system needs to reevaluate how those connections are made, and it can't be individual foragers. It has to be a community of foragers. And how do we change the system so that we look at it that way, as opposed to the capitalist system, which says tragedy of the common states that an individual forager will probably exploit the resource. So it's really a question about America's values when we try to ask that question, answer that question.
Thank you, A-dae. It's, you know, it's blowing up in the chat here. Somebody had a lot to say about that they also agreed with you. So I'm gonna ask a final question, well, two final questions. This one is about appropriation, because there are chefs who are forager chefs. It's a thing. And they, you know, somebody wants to know, like, you're making money off of this knowledge, usually somebody else's knowledge. And wants to know, like, how do you run a business in a way that respects and honors the source that allows for this? And so, you know, Kim, I'm going to ask your opinion first, just because you know, you've talked to so many different kinds of people. And then, you know, I will kick it out to the rest of the group. But Kim, how do people honor the source?
Oh gosh. Well, you know, I've talked to different folks from different tribes. I think either A-dae or Twila could probably, because Twila has that firsthand knowledge. So I'll pass that along to her. Twila, do you?
Okay, go ahead.
So somebody wants to know, they're a chef, they're a forager chef, and they want to know, you know, with regard to appropriation, you know, you're looking to what other people are doing and making money off of that knowledge. And so they want to know, how do you run a business in a way that honors the source of that, you know, of that knowledge keeping, of that wisdom?
There's a for myself, I limit myself into what I use out there. Like if I was to do catering or to do events, and I limit myself to what is already out there compared to what is used for ceremony, what is used for these other things. It's just being mindful and respectful, and just knowing what is allowable. And each indigenous tribe has their own, how you say, their own standards of what's allowable and not allowable. So like myself, I cannot answer for all these other different indigenous chefs. I only can answer for myself because I know what I'm allowed. And for other tribes or other indigenous chefs, it's really based on talking to their elders from their communities, or talking to policymakers in their communities, because every policy is totally different from the community I am from. So that's a very individual question.
Thank you.
And I'll just add, when we think of like what, I don't know what that may be referring to, but if a chef is ever in the position where they're saying like, how do I honor the indigenous people who created this dish? Like I would hope there's an indigenous person standing beside them, or I would hope that they're giving the recipe and the name of that dish and not renaming it, you know, that because that we see that happen a lot in the culinary world. But more importantly, like if there is a chef ever in that position, there's going to be pushback, right? There's going to be pushback because that chef will have to think about why they are in the position to present that dish and not the people who created it. That is ultimately the question that needs to be answered. And until we have a good answer to that question, there's always going to be pushback. Sanjay, can you also add?
Yeah, I was just going to say lastly that the chances are no matter where a professional restaurateur or chef lives, there is probably a federally recognized tribe or an established tribe within a stone's throw. And one can't, I'm just saying, just from the experience of making this movie, can't expect to rock up into Indian country with a question and get an answer right away. But it is worthwhile trying to build relationships, and it might take months, it might take years to get to the stage where you have enough of a relationship with the first peoples of your area where you can honestly ask them, if they trust you, you can honestly ask them, you know, is this approach appropriating? Or if I wanted to do something like this, how do I need to do it? And it's not going to be a simple process. We're so used to in the food system, you know, making instant coffee. But when it comes to getting inspiration from traditional food sources and traditional people, you know, you need to prove yourself. You need to prove yourself to them that you're ready to accept their knowledge. Then you have to be ready to receive that knowledge and ready to transform it with them into something to share with the public. And it might take some time and it might not happen.
Thank you, Sanjay. And I have a final question, and it is for each of you. And Sanjay, I will save you for last on this one. From your vantage point as a participant in this particular film and project, what is the takeaway that you would like to leave people with? Those of us who've seen the film, those of us who are about to see the film, what do you want people to leave with? We'll start with Twila.
Wow. For us, it's just that there's so much that this, not only this country, but this world can learn from indigenous people and the perspective of using traditional foods. And there's a lot of different, how can I say this? What do I really want to take away? You know what? I actually had this the other day and I'm thinking now, I just like, even though I'm not on screen, I froze. But just knowing, I don't know, I just that we all seem to have a calling to improve the lifeways of our indigenous communities and to empower each individual, each tribe. Um, let's take back that, how you say, creating food policies in Indian country, creating a whole different view of things and making this, how you say, a step forward for our young people, because this is, we're just at the middle of losing our traditional ways of life and moving forward. So we want to carry a lot of this forward and hoping that this, what they've done with this film is ensure that a part of this life is not lost and that it exists and it's going to move forward and may empower our young people to carry on this knowledge and to share it, to learn from it, and to grow from it. It's just, it's been an amazing journey with Sanjay and A-dae and Kim and everybody on this film to come into our lives and let us share our knowledge with them and share a way of I don't know, it's like sharing a part of us with the world, but knowing that we're making a difference and we're hoping to make that, a part of something. I'm gonna ramble too, so I'm gonna stop.
It's fine.
Okay.
From your vantage point, Kim, as a person who collected, stories for years about these different, groups of people and their ways of doing, like what is the takeaway you want people to have from your work?
Well, I think the basis of the film is a lot of what happened and the impact when this destruction happened. There's a lot of positives. The work that First Nations is doing, obviously, lots of work that other folks are doing everywhere from, A-dae mentioned the I Collective, all the chefs that are incorporating not only traditional foods, but modern methods, modern foods. I'm thinking of a story that we did. Mariah Gladstone, who's from the Blackfeet Nation, she has a YouTube channel called Indigit Kitchen. And what she does is she takes that traditional basis, but uses modern type of either foods or methods. One example would be when she made, just watching the YouTube channel, canned salmon, and she used, different nuts and berries, just, simple things that she did. She either does the foraging, or she has family members bring her ingredients, or she just goes down to the local farmers market and gets what she can to, the basis of her recipes are based on all of these ancient grains, chia or rice or sweeteners, maple syrup, but she's doing it in a modern way so that she can carry this knowledge on to folks, especially the younger people. That's what the article was about, the younger people using YouTube, Facebook, social media, websites to get other young people involved and interested in saying, you don't need to go to the grocery store, or if you do, you can get these items, but you can also go to your backyard and get these types of things. And so that's what I think this is what it really helped me, is just the positives. There's so much work out there. Folks are saying that this is new or trendy, but as we've all been saying, this is just things that we've been doing as Indigenous people, time immemorial. We just have different methods of telling our stories now.
Thank you, Kim. Was that, you said Indigit Kitchen, right?
Yes, Mariah Gladstone, she's from the Blackfeet Nation, and yes, she produces a weekly or bi-weekly or bi-monthly podcast.
Okay. And A-dae, based on your contributions and your work on this film, what do you hope people leave with?
I want people to leave this film and say, I want Twila on my team. I want Clayton on my team. I want Nephi on my team. Indigenous people are some of the most beautiful people in this world. They have so much to offer. They have so much to teach this world. Every conversation about climate change, about food policy, about how we're dealing with pandemics should include an Indigenous person. And I think I'm just going to tell a really quick story about my husband. When I first met him, like he served me deer meat that he hunted. He brought me a zucchini that he grew and picked, the salad from the green tea picked. I thought that was the most beautiful thing in the world. And I said, if I'm ever in a global apocalypse, I want to be next to him. And I want people to say the same thing about our characters and about Indigenous people. If we're ever in a global apocalypse, I hope that there's an Indigenous person you know that you can talk to and you want to be around.
Thank you, A-dae. And final thoughts, Sanjay, about your work in this film. What do you want people to leave with?
And when I meet people like Twila and Nephi and the other characters in the film, I realize how close they are to their food. And Nephi talks about in the movie this genetic spark that happens when Apache people eat Apache foods. And if you think about our own heritage as human beings, we weren't nomadic hundreds of years ago to the degree that we are now. You know, we were in villages, we knew food systems, we had 100, if not 1,000-year-old traditions, and our bodies and our spirituality evolved with certain places, certain tastes, certain smells. And for those of us who aren't lucky enough to be indigenous to Turtle Island, to the Western Hemisphere, those internal sparks are things that we need to rediscover. We need to find out the foods that our great-great-grandparents ate. We need to find out the meanings of those foods. And if we can't ever really deserve to be on land that's traditionally native, we can at least express to them those same indigenous qualities that they hold so dear. We can value the land, we can value our food, we can value our relationships with the land and our food. That's what I hope people get inspired by in the movie, and I hope people take away.
Thank you, Sanjay. And so I want to thank Sanjay, A-dae, Twila, and Kim for sharing their time with us and sharing this film and their work and their passion with us. I've certainly learned a lot, both from watching this film and also having this conversation. I would encourage those of you who haven't had the opportunity to watch it yet, you have the link for another 72 hours. So I encourage you to watch it. The film becomes widely available in September. Kind of kept the speakers like handles up if you want to follow them. And then you can also learn more at jamesbeard.org/open for good at the James Beard Foundation. Every second Tuesday of the month, we actually have a conversation curated by A-dae Romero-Briones for the First Nations Institute, and so you can learn a lot more. And so stay tuned for more content. Thank you, Sanjay. And you can also visit firstnations.org to find out about more screenings of Gather. So I want to thank you all and have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.